The pregnant woman carrying my husband's child was sitting in my mother's chair when I walked into my own living room at 7:04 that Tuesday night. Not beside it. Not near it. But sunk into the high-backed cream armchair Celia Ellery had kept by the front window, one hand resting on her stomach, and the other rubbing the worn seam my mother used to touch while reading bills. Graham stood behind her, with his mouth already shaped like an apology, while his mother Marlene watched me as if grief were something she could schedule, supervise, and finish before dessert. There were 6 people in my house who had not been invited, and every one of them looked too comfortable with the mistake they had made. Calvin had placed a folder on my coffee table, Delaney held a teacup from my mother's blue set, and Kelsey Voss looked around the room with the quiet hunger of a woman deciding which walls would need repainting. I did not scream, because the entry log, the hotel bills, and Kelsey's invoice were already printed upstairs, waiting in the drawer beside the staircase. I looked at her hand moving over that chair and felt something in me go still enough to become useful. "Take your hand off my mother's chair," I said, and the room tightened because nobody had expected my first sentence to be that clean. Kelsey blinked. Graham swallowed, and Marlene's face hardened just enough to tell me this had never been a conversation. Only a takeover dressed in family concern. That chair had outlived 2 apartments. One divorce she never discussed. And every cheap thing my mother refused to buy because cheap things made women dependent. Celia Ellery restored rare books for people who insured their dining tables for more than she made in a year. And she learned early that beautiful things survived only when someone documented ownership. She bought the Lincoln Park brownstone before Graham ever knew my last name, then placed it inside a living trust, with my name written so clearly no husband could smudge it later. My mother was not sentimental in the way people expect grieving daughters to describe their mothers, because Celia loved through receipts, labels, locks, and signatures. When Graham proposed, she kissed my forehead, studied his soft smile for 1 second too long, and told me, "Love is not a deed. Brenna." I laughed then, because I was 29 and still foolish enough to think a warning sounded less romantic than a promise. She did not laugh with me, and 2 weeks before the wedding, she made me sit beside her at the dining table while Ruth Calder explained separate property in plain English. The deed stayed mine. The trust stayed mine. The tax records stayed clean. And not $1 from our joint account ever touched the house repairs. Celia signed the final folder with a hand already stiff from arthritis and pushed it toward me like she was sliding a shield across polished wood. After she died, Graham moved through those rooms with the careless comfort of a man who had mistaken access for ownership. He paid for dinners, clothes, and half-finished ambitions, but never for the roof, the taxes, the insurance, or the chair Kelsey had chosen without understanding its weight. That was why seeing her fingers on the worn cream seam did not break me. It reminded me exactly where my mother had hidden the knife. I did not discover Graham's affair because lipstick stained a collar or perfume lingered on his shirt like something a cheaper story would understand. I found it because a $1,180 charge appeared on our joint card under a Gold Coast hotel restaurant. Dated the same night. Graham claimed he was hosting a whiskey tasting for regional buyers. When I opened the statement, the line item sat there with its polished little lie, and my whole marriage suddenly looked like a ledger waiting to be reconciled. I worked as a senior risk underwriter, which meant suspicion was never useful until it became documentation. I downloaded the PDF, matched the date against his calendar, found the boutique hotel attached to the restaurant, and noticed 2 more charges hidden under language vague enough to insult me. Graham had called them client development expenses, but the room service detail showed 2 breakfasts, 1 bottle of champagne, and a late checkout he never mentioned. When I asked about the tasting 2 days later, he kissed my temple without looking up from his phone and murmured, "Babe." It was exhausting. That was the first time his softness looked less like kindness and more like furniture arranged to block a door. I smiled, poured coffee, and let him believe the woman balancing his mortgage-free life had not just found the first loose thread. The second thread was Kelsey Voss, paid through 3 electronic transfers Graham labeled event prep, all from money he still expected me to treat as shared. Her invoice described a private residential transition consultation, which would have sounded harmless if she had been choosing linens instead of helping him plan my removal. Then I found the email she sent him at 12:16 a.m. Your mother is right. She'll leave faster if everyone is there. That sentence did what jealousy never could. It removed the last soft place I had left for misunderstanding. I called Ruth Calder before breakfast, and she listened without interrupting while I read the charges. The invoice language, and the email twice. Ruth's answer came clean and dry through the phone. Do not confront him. Brenna. Preserve everything, because pain fades, but records survive discovery. By the end of that week, I had hotel bills, calendar screenshots, transfer confirmations, Kelsey's invoice, and a draft occupancy letter Graham had been stupid enough to save in shared cloud storage. Ruth explained that Illinois would not turn adultery into a criminal spectacle, but dissipation of marital assets could matter very much in divorce. Then my own test came back positive, and I folded that fact into silence. Because Graham had already taught me what happened when women trusted him with truth too early. I learned about the ambush because Graham forgot the old hallway speaker still carried sound from the pantry when the switch beside the basement door stayed on. He was pacing under the cabinet light, voice lowered into that careful tone he used when he wanted cowardice to sound like consideration. I don't want a scene, Mom, he breathed, and Marlene's voice came back thin through the wall, telling him scenes happened only when women refused order. She told him Tuesday at 7, because I would be home, because Calvin had already looked over the settlement language, because Delaney would keep Kelsey calm. Then came the part that made my hand tighten around the glass I was holding. Kelsey has to be there. Graham. The baby needs to be visible. He did not argue. Not once. And that silence told me he had stopped being dragged by his family long before they reached my door. The next morning, I found Delaney's text thread in the cloud backup Graham still shared with the old tablet he never used. She had written, "Stay soft. Touch your belly. Let Mom speak first." And Kelsey had answered with a heart like they were planning seating for brunch. Calvin's proposal sat beneath it, offering me a neat little payout if I left my own house within 30 days and agreed not to dispute the divorce. Ruth listened while I read every line, then cut through my anger with the kind of calm that made panic feel amateur. Illinois is an all-party consent state, Brenna, so do not secretly record them. Let the documents speak, and let witnesses remember what they chose to say. So I printed the entry log, the invoice, the email, the trust abstract, and the draft letter, then placed tea on the table like mercy. By Tuesday evening, the house smelled faintly of bergamot and old wood, the way it always did when rain pressed against the lakefront air. I left the front room neat, not welcoming, just controlled enough for people who confused politeness with surrender. When Kelsey walked in behind Graham and looked first at the molding, then the dining room, then my mother's chair, I knew exactly what she had been promised. Marlene began once everyone had accepted a cup, which told me she had mistaken my tea for surrender and my silence for permission. We are adults here, Brenna, and Kelsey is carrying Graham's child. So the kindest thing now is order, she offered, hands folded like a verdict. I watched Kelsey lower her eyes on cue, one palm curved over her stomach, exactly the way Delaney's text had instructed. Calvin cleared his throat and slid the folder forward, the paper making a soft scrape across my mother's coffee table. This house is too much for one person. When Graham needs stability for his family now, he began, as if theft became practical when spoken slowly. Delaney leaned in before I answered, her voice gentler than her message history. You and Graham don't have children, Brenna, and that changes the moral picture. Kelsey lifted her face then, wide-eyed and careful, wearing softness like borrowed cashmere. I don't want your pain, she breathed, while her fingers stayed wrapped around the arm of Celia's chair. I just want the baby to have one home, not a scandal. Graham looked at the floor, and that almost made me laugh, because even in his own betrayal, he wanted someone else to hold the room. I never wanted it like this, he whispered, and I let the sentence sit until every person heard how small it was. No, I answered, keeping my hands around the teacup. You wanted it cleaner. Calvin frowned first, because men like him always heard numbers before shame. I looked at the folder near his wrist and asked whether his clean payout included the hotel charges, the champagne, and the transfers marked event prep. His jaw closed, and the room learned that the quiet wife had been reading more than grief. Delaney shifted beside him, so I turned before she could find another moral speech to hide inside. Does touch your belly and let mom speak count as professional advice? Or was that just sisterly strategy? I asked, and her face drained before Kelsey's did. Graham finally looked at me then, not with remorse, but with the panic of a man realizing the room had a witness he had underestimated. Marlene's voice sharpened as she placed her cup down harder than necessary. Careful, Brenna. You don't want people thinking you punished a pregnant woman. I stood slowly, reached for the folder I had placed beside my chair, and met Kelsey's eyes as her hand finally left the seam. No, I said. I want them reading what she signed. I opened my folder slowly, not because I wanted drama, but because paper deserved more respect than the people sitting around it. The trust abstract came first, then the deed, then the premarital asset schedule, each page placed flat where Marlene's teacup had left a damp ring. This brownstone belongs to the Celia Ellery Living Trust, transferred to me before marriage, and never converted into marital property. I said. Marlene lifted her chin, reaching for the phrase she had clearly practiced. Brenna, it has been Graham's home, too, she pressed, as if warmth could overwrite a recorded deed. A family home is not the same thing as your son's property, I answered, and Calvin's eyes dropped to the signature line. Then I placed the maintenance ledger beside the insurance policy, because Celia had taught me that ownership was not a feeling people could borrow. The taxes came from my separate account. The roof repair came from my separate account. And Graham's name appeared nowhere, except as an emergency contact. Graham stared at the pages like they had betrayed him, though they had been honest longer than he had. I moved next to the card statements, and the room changed before I spoke, because numbers do not blush, but guilty people do. Your son spent marital money on hotel rooms, champagne, travel, and payments to Kelsey while preparing to ask me for a clean divorce, I said. Kelsey's breath caught when I set her invoice on top, the one titled Private Residential Transition Consultation in her own electronic signature. The house is my mother's, the bills are Graham's, and the fake paper has Kelsey's name on it. Nobody moved after that, because the sentence had not accused them. It had arranged them. Graham pushed himself halfway up, and I looked at him once before his courage found bad timing. Sit down before you make Ruth's job easier, I said, and he obeyed so quickly, Delaney looked away from him. I explained civil remedies, dissipation claims, attorney fees, preservation demands, and the no-contact notice Ruth Calder would send by morning. Kelsey whispered, Are you trying to ruin me? And I answered without raising my voice. No, I am naming what you helped build. Then I reached into the inside pocket of my cardigan and felt the folded paper waiting against my palm. Graham saw the movement and finally looked afraid for the right reason. Not because he was losing a house, but because he had not finished losing me. I held up the lab confirmation long enough for every face to understand before I said, "I am 6 weeks pregnant." For 3 seconds. No one seemed to understand English, because the lab confirmation in my hand had turned every prepared speech into furniture. Graham stared at the paper first, then at my face, then at Kelsey's stomach, as if betrayal had suddenly become complicated math. "You're pregnant?" he managed, and the crack in his voice arrived far too late to be useful. "Yes," I answered, folding the confirmation back into my cardigan before Marlene could turn it into family property with her eyes. 6 weeks, and every discussion about paternity, custody, or this divorce will go through Ruth Calder after filing. Kelsey made a small sound from my mother's chair, but for once she did not touch her stomach like it was a legal argument. Marlene stood so quickly her teacup rattled, her face rebuilding itself into grandmotherly warmth, while the papers on the table proved the previous version. "Oh, Brenna, sweetheart, why didn't you tell us?" she breathed, already reaching toward me like 11 minutes could be erased by contact. I stepped back once, just enough for her hands to close around nothing, and answered, "Because 11 minutes ago, your love needed me gone by month's end." Delaney started crying then, soft and sudden, but her text thread still sat open beside Kelsey's invoice, making the tears look underprepared. Calvin muttered something about a revised arrangement, and I looked at the settlement folder until his mouth finally stopped moving. "Every offer goes to Ruth tomorrow," I said. "And tonight? Everyone who entered with Graham's spare key leaves through my front door." Graham looked ruined in a way I might have once mistaken for pain, if I had not seen him practice helplessness for years. "Brenna, is the baby mine?" he asked. And Kelsey turned toward him so sharply, the room heard her breathing change. "You lost the right to ask me that in a room you filled with witnesses," I answered, and opened the door. Cold air moved into the hallway, carrying the smell of rain and traffic from Lincoln Park, clean enough to cut through the bergamot tea. No one argued, because ownership, money, pregnancy, and shame had all landed in the same room with their names attached. Graham was the last to leave, and when I closed the door behind him, the lock sounded calmer than any apology he had ever given me. By 9 the next morning, Ruth Calder had turned my quiet living room into a paper trail no one in the Riddle family could soften. Graham received formal notice to return every key, preserve every financial record, stop entering the brownstone, and communicate only through counsel. Kelsey received her own letter. Not dramatic, not cruel, just precise enough to make the words "no contact" feel like a locked gate. The divorce filing stayed no fault because Illinois did not need a morality play to end a marriage. But Ruth attached the dissipation claim like a blade under clean linen. Every hotel stay, champagne charge, transfer, and event styling payment moved from betrayal into arithmetic, where Graham's excuses had no room to breathe. When he called once from a blocked number and whispered, "Please don't do this like a war," I hung up before his weakness could ask for comfort. His company did not fire him because he cheated, and Ruth made sure I understood that distinction before grief tried to simplify it. They opened an internal review because his client development expenses overlapped with hotel stays, false tasting notes, and payments tied to Kelsey's private invoices. By Friday, the brand partnerships director who sold trust for expensive whiskey had become a liability wrapped in a navy suit. Marlene's fall was quieter, which made it meaner in the circles she cared about most. A donor from her spring gala asked why she had entered another woman's home with a pregnant mistress and a settlement folder. And charity women do not need headlines when whispers arrive with receipts. She resigned from one committee for personal reasons, then another for family priorities. Both phrases polished enough to smell like panic. Delaney lost 3 admissions clients after one mother heard enough to decide moral judgment was part of a consultant's product. Calvin paid Graham's retainer, then stopped calling me practical and started calling the situation unfortunate, which told me he finally understood ownership had teeth. Kelsey's private party bookings thinned out when people realized her residential transition consultation meant helping a married man install her in his wife's house. I never posted a photo, never leaked a message, and never turned my pain into something strangers could pass around for entertainment. The room had contained 6 witnesses, 6 motives, and enough documents to make every denial expensive. I did not ruin them. I let their own signatures introduce them properly. The divorce finalized on a gray Thursday morning, with Lake Michigan wind pressing against Ruth Calder's office windows like something trying to get inside. Ruth read the final order twice, then looked over her glasses and said, "The brownstone remains yours, cleanly and completely." Graham received no equity claim, no emergency sympathy discount, and a dissipation offset large enough to make his clean exit look very dirty. I did not chase every claim until it bled, because peace also has a price, and I had already paid enough in silence. The no-contact letters stayed in force. The keys stayed returned, and the chair stayed exactly where Celia had left it. Marlene sent a 417-word apology with the subject line, "From the heart," and I saved it without opening the attachment. Graham moved into a rented apartment west of the river, where his new consulting work depended on people not asking why he left whiskey branding. Kelsey disappeared from the private event lists she once treated like stepping stones, and Delaney's last message said, "I was protecting family." I answered once, "You were protecting access," then blocked the number before her guilt could become another room in my house. By spring, the nursery was ready, not because I needed a perfect new beginning, but because I finally had a quiet one. I kept Celia's coffee stain on the chair, placed a blue throw across the back, and let the afternoon light touch both without apology. When my daughter moved inside me, small and certain, I understood that I had not inherited shelter. I had inherited proof that I was never supposed to beg for it. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If any part of Brenna's silence, strength, or healing felt familiar, share your thoughts below. Sometimes peace begins when a woman finally stops explaining why she deserves a safe home, a clean future, and a life no one else gets to claim.